going here. And I'm going to start with a short recap of the events that led up to the British occupation of Philadelphia. So, Major General William Howe entered the Chesapeake Bay and he sailed up to its northern extremity and he set his troops ashore on August 25th, 1777. And of course, General George Washington knew that Philadelphia was their target. And as Brad mentioned, Philadelphia was the capital. So that's what they were aiming for. And so Washington moved his army overland from New Jersey into Pennsylvania, and then he met the enemy in a series of short encounters, beginning with the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, 1777. At Brandywine, the Continental Army was forced to retreat after its right flank broke. 5 days later, the Americans made a stand against the pursuing British, but a sudden rainstorm brought an end to the fighting, and Washington retreated toward Reading. And some of us were on a bus trip yesterday where we heard a little bit more about this, but Reading was an important store of munitions and food. It was just a small country town at the time, but the area was very important because of the iron produced, because they were, the center for munitions and also an area where there was food that could feed the troops. So even though the city wasn't a city then, it was just a little country town, and it basically extended from Walnut Street south to Chestnut Street, and just, the first few blocks you can kind of see in this map. It was a very important location, and Washington really wanted to protect that. So he feared that Reading would be targeted by the British, and he set up headquarters at Pottsgrove Manor so he could position the army between, position his army between the invading army and the supply stores that were being held at Reading. So with the British advancing toward Philadelphia, the Continental Congress fled first for Lancaster on September 19th, 1777, and then by the end of that month moved on to York. So 2 days after Congress left the city of brotherly love, a surprise attack on Anthony Wayne's forces removed the last barrier to the capital and cleared the way for General Howe to invade Philadelphia on September 26th. The diarist Jacob Hiltsheimer, who was a Philadelphian, a trade silversmith, and a prosperous farmer, was also a livestock trader and supplier of horses to Washington's army. And we're going to rely a lot on what Hiltsheimer recorded. So he recorded the general panic in Philadelphia as the enemy army advanced. At 1 o'clock this morning, he wrote, news came to town that General Howe's army was crossing the Schuylkill at Swedes Ford, which sent many people moving. And he wrote that on September 19th, 1777. 2 days later, he added, the city much alarmed and people moving out. Now, just a word about the illustrations. This program really doesn't have illustrations, but because we've all kind of become so visually oriented and we expect to see them, I've tried to pick things that will somehow fit with what I'm talking about. So this is actually a painting of firefighting in Philadelphia, but I thought it sort of fits the panic that as the invaders came in and maybe things were set on fire. So as the British drew nearer to Philadelphia, several of the city's premier families prepared to evacuate. Now these people, when I say premier families, I mean wealthy families. These were the social leaders, the wealthy families, and they packed up all of their expensive goods. So they packed chests full of linens, expensive linens, clothing. They crammed their polished silver and their fine bone china into trunks, and everything was all cushioned with straw. And they loaded it up into carts and wagons. They took their family portraits. They took their musical instruments, their choice furniture, everything they could. And they sent all of those treasures out of the city of Philadelphia under the protection of their servants, and in many cases, their slaves. They were, many of them, slaveholders. And then once they were sure that they were going to have all the comforts that, all the things that they needed to give a comfortable, genteel lifestyle, they evacuated Philadelphia themselves. And many of them headed for Reading or other outlying towns. So the evacuees that were destined for Reading were the creme de la creme of Philadelphia society. And some of them, including the family of one, Reynold Keene, were among the few Philadelphians who actually owned some type of 2- or 4-wheeled conveyance, they would have called it. And that was something only the wealthiest people could afford. It costs a lot of money, first off, to buy a coach or a carriage, or, there's all a postchaise, and I don't even know how to pronounce some of these things. And to keep horses, to buy horses and to feed them and stable them and have somebody to care for them. So this was something the general population, if they really needed, it would be like renting a car. They would go to a livery stable and they would rent an equipage and the horse needed to take them somewhere, or they would take public transportation, a stage. So these families coming here, many of them had their own vehicles, what we would think of, the equivalent of an automobile for us today. And Reynold Keene was one of 84 Philadelphians listed in a log or a listing of those in 1772 who owned some kind of coach or carriage or other equipage. So only out of, I'm not sure what the population of Philadelphia was at that point, but I'm sure it, that was a big city. There were quite, and to think that only 84 people, 84 families owned something like this, that really puts him in a minority. So his family is one of the families that came to Reading, this very wealthy family. About 20 to 30 families followed Washington northwest toward Pottsgrove Manor, and then pushed past what's now Pottstown, through Old Merlauten Village and on to Reading. Jacob Hiltzheimer, the diarist, was politically connected, and he sent out public funds, books, and documents all to New Jersey for safekeeping. And then he also packed a wagon load of his own personal goods and sent them to Northampton County. Then he and his family left Philadelphia and headed toward New Jersey on September 24th, just 2 days before Howe and the British Army invaded the city of Philadelphia. Now, we don't know, because Hiltzheimer doesn't tell us in his diary, but for some reason, he must have changed his mind, and maybe he had business to tend to in New Jersey, so he went there first, or maybe he got there and he found it wasn't unsuitable. We really don't, and we don't know. But for whatever reason, he packed up his stuff on October 6, 1777, and sent everything to Reading. And then 4 days later, he and his family passed through the town of Reading and settled 3 miles outside the town as guests of General Thomas Mifflin on his plantation, Angelica. And you got to remember that Angelica at that time was like 500 or more acres. And of course, we know that part of the plantation later became the site of the Berks County Almshouse, and also is now, part of the campus of the Governor Mifflin High School. So Brigadier Mifflin at the time was a brigadier general, and he was later elected as the first governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So once these very wealthy Philadelphians got here to Reading, they weren't really too happy with their accommodations. So the houses, they called them pokey houses lining the muddy streets. They complained the streets were very muddy, and they were just a far cry from the fashionable, commodious Philadelphia townhomes that they lived in before coming here. But they did take some comfort in having all their best furniture and their portraits and their other possessions at hand. And there is one humorous anecdote recorded by American Army Captain Andrew Graydon in his memoir. So I'll tell you a little about how he came to stay here, and then I'll share the anecdote. So I'm going to fall down the rabbit hole a little bit here. So Graydon had been taken prisoner by the British and held on Long Island, but he was exchanged for a British officer and released. His mother was here in Reading with the refugees, so he came to Reading to stay with her after he was released. And in their cramped quarters, the mother and son were attended by two elderly servants that they brought along with them. And they enjoyed entertaining some of the British officers who were prisoners of war, who were being held in Reading. And those prisoners of war had a great deal of freedom. So this was another kind of bone of contention between the wealthy Philadelphians and the local people, because the local people were extremely zealous in their patriotism. And when they saw these Philadelphians entertaining and socializing with the British officers who were being held in Reading as prisoners of war, they felt that they were acting as traitors. But to the Philadelphians, these people were on the same level of social status. And so, well, these were the people they wanted to associate with. They didn't want to have anything to do with those Pennsylvania Germans in Reading, but those farm people who were just coming into town and pretenders. So when Graydon and his mother were here, they entertained the British captain Speke. And when Speke arrived in their little cramped quarters, Graydon actually had to apologize. He apologized for the awkward form and low ceiling of the room. But looking around, Speke exclaimed, "By faith, you've made the most of it with furniture," which is sort of a little bit of a snide comment, because he's commenting on how much furniture they had crammed into that room. And then Graydon says it was true enough, as the room was unmercifully overloaded with chairs, tables, and family portraits. So that just gives you kind of a little idea. So now Graydon himself described the Refugee Society in Reading as sufficiently large and select. So that gives you a really good idea of, these people. And he also said that their time in Reading in Berks County was gay and agreeable. Not exactly how we think of refugees today. So in general, these elitist Philadelphians really disdained the local Pennsylvania German population, and they called them an ugly name. They called them Dutch buggers. And there's a wonderful manuscript that is in the Janssen Library by Philip Pendleton. It was his thesis, and it's called Dutch Buggers. And it's all about this period and the tensions among these two groups in Reading. So these Philadelphians in general, they avoided intermingling with any of the locals, except they socialized with a few upper crust Berks County families who were mostly of British extraction and had Philadelphia connections of some kind. And of course, that included Thomas Mifflin, who was born in Philadelphia and educated in Philadelphia. So the refugees spent the fall and winter in Reading and Berks County planning and indulging in exclusive card parties. They held balls, musicals, events, musical soirees, sleigh rides once it started to snow. And there was a lot more snow in that time than there is now. So sleigh rides were a big thing. Other entertainments, when it was nicer weather, they took excursions to the countryside. They visited Thomas Mifflin. They visited Colonel Mark Byrd, who was a prominent ironmaster and builder of, well, I guess his son was the builder of Hopewell Furnace. No, Mark was builder of Hopewell Furnace. They organized what they called horse trials, which were horse races. They had fowl shoots and fox hunts and parties at all these country estates. And now you might be wondering, as I did, why was Thomas Mifflin at home entertaining? What was he doing hosting horse races and dinner parties? Wasn't he a major general? Why wasn't he with Washington or out doing his duty? Well, we know from history, and we also know from Alexander Graydon why Mifflin was at home. Graydon tells us General Mifflin at this area was at home, a chief out of war, complaining, though not ill, considerably of malcontent, and apparently not in high favor at headquarters. Mifflin was one of those people who disagreed with Washington's war strategy and wanted to replace Washington with Horatio Gates. So in general, the refugees at Reading were not overly zealous in their dedication to the independence cause. So Phil Pendleton, in his thesis, tells us that many among them would have happily made peace with Great Britain while negotiating some rights and representation for the American colonies. And some may have been counted among those who were known as the disaffected, who were neither loyalists nor revolutionaries. And if anyone knows Jim Lors, he's a trustee of the Historic Preservation Trust of Berks County and the retired director of the Landis Valley Farm Museum. And he also had been at one point in his career director of the Daniel Boone Homestead and the Conrad Weiser Homestead. So Lawar says that there's a really wonderful book, if you want to look up more on this subject, called The Disaffected. And it was written by a Temple University professor, Aaron Sullivan. And according to Sullivan, the percentage of what was called the disaffected in southeastern Pennsylvania's population was far greater than what was previously thought, and that greatly influenced the events of 1777 and 1778. So, for instance, the decision to camp the army at Valley Forge was a political move based on the desire to influence the population in the area just outside the city of Philadelphia. And military leaders really wanted to camp the army between Reading and Lancaster instead. But because of the politics, it was Valley Forge. So included among these so-called disaffected were members of the Society of Friends who, as pacifists, opposed the war on religious grounds. And also some Anglicans who felt that they had a sense of loyalty to their king as the head of the church. So there were religious reasons for some of these so-called disaffected. Most Quakers refused to take up arms during the war, and some even saw taxation or the use of continental currency as involvement in the conflict. And because of this, Quakers were often considered enemies of the independence cause. Just days before the British invasion, 20 Quaker men were imprisoned for refusing to sign oaths of loyalty to the revolutionary government. And Jim Lors says these folks were loaded into wagons and forcefully placed into exile. Some were taken to Pottsgrove Manor for a night, and then passing by the White Horse Inn in Old Morlotton Village, now Douglasville, they proceeded to Reading. They were kept at Reading for about a week, and then they were taken to Virginia to be exiled indefinitely, and their estates were confiscated by the state government. The state government needed money for the revolution. And so among those who were exiled was the husband of the Quaker diarist, Elizabeth Sandwith Drinker, who wrote about the network of Quaker wives who were left in Philadelphia to face the occupation on their own. And that's another whole story. So for non-Quaker families of wealth and position, there could also be a lot at stake when choosing sides, depending on the outcome of the conflict. And neutrality was a way of preserving self-interest, regardless of which side emerged as the winner. So it was natural for that some local resentment was going to develop between these Philadelphians who were basically just biding their time in Reading, hiding out, but living large. And the rancor was particularly pronounced among the local Pennsylvania Germans who were generally scorned by the Philadelphians. And many of the Pennsylvania Dutch, especially those in Reading, were enthusiastic, zealous supporters of the American independence cause. And according to Phil Pendleton, many Reading artisans were energetic members of the radical wing of patriots known as the Whigs. And the Whigs were concentrated in Philadelphia and dominated the Commonwealth government for several years following 1776. And they sought aggressively to move Pennsylvania's society toward economic and social equality. So they definitely don't like these highfalutin Philadelphians. Now, among the group of Philadelphia refugees staying at Reading was the beautiful 23-year-old bride of American naval captain John Barry, later known as Commodore Barry, father of the American Navy. And I always say Commodore Barry, not just the bridge we cross on our way to the Jersey Shore. So she was popular and pretty. He was a widower when they met, and she kind of got him out of his funk. She went up to him at a ball and pretty much did the unthinkable, asked him to dance, got him moving, and he was just bowled over by her charm and vivacity. So her name was Sarah. She was called Sally. Sally was a popular nickname for Sarah. A lot of Sallys were really christened Sarah. And they were newly married. They had only been married in July, a few months before the British invasion of Philadelphia. So in Reading, Sally joined her half-sister, Christiana Stille Keene, and Christiana's husband, Reynold Keene, and the Keene's children. Now, Keene had actually rented a house in Reading town, earlier that year. But he also had properties in Philadelphia, had a house in Philadelphia, had business interests, estates in Philadelphia and in the surrounding countryside. And he traveled back and forth frequently to attend to business. But he was like trying to branch northwest, I guess, toward Reading. And a lot of merchants were doing that. A lot of professionals were doing that. Attorneys were doing that because Philadelphia was becoming a little overcrowded with businessmen and professionals, and they knew that there were better opportunities in Reading, and that Reading was going to grow. So Keene was a wealthy merchant and estate owner, and he had varied business interests, and his push toward Reading was for economic reasons more than safety. But fortunately, he just happened to be, have an establishment already in Reading, and his family could come from Philadelphia to Reading during the occupation. So I'll move on here. Earlier in 1777, Reynold Keene had been appointed along with a local man, Colonel Henry Haller, who was a commander of the local militia, and some others. They were appointed to a Berks County commission that was formed to audit and settle the properties of all those who were missing in action, taken prisoner, killed, or otherwise died while in service. And Henry Haller was an innkeeper, a tailor. He owned a Reading bootery. He was a local businessman of some prominence, and he had been one of the Berks delegates to the provincial conference held in June of 1776 at Carpenter Hall in Philadelphia. he had anglicized to a certain extent, calling himself Henry. His birth name was Johann Heinrich Haller, and he was born in Switzerland in 1731. And he was the only person of Germanic ancestry who was appointed to that commission. All the others were members of what we call the Anglican elite. So, doubtless Christiana Keene was pleased to have her half-sister, Sally Barry, with her to help her with the children. By the end of September 1777, Christiana was 8 months pregnant with her 10th child. Her husband wrote in a letter to his friend, the surveyor John Lukens of Philadelphia, that Christiana was comforted by agreeable neighbors, but dearly missed her friends who remained in Philadelphia. Her pregnancy does not appear to have been troublesome, and in Keene's October 31st letter, he wrote to Lukens that Christiana was well and hourly expecting to add to our number of little ones. Their baby daughter was born that night and named Sarah after Christiana and Sally's mother, and Christiana never completely recovered from that birth, or it's possible that she just fell ill shortly after, because by December 5th, 1777, she was dead at the age of 33. And that day, December 5th, 1777, Jacob Hiltzheimer recorded in his diary that he rode into town from Angelica to serve as one of her pallbearers. Christiana's remains were interred in the Christ Church graveyard on Callow Hill Street, now 5th Street in Reading. And after her death, her 10 children, ranging in age from newborn to 14, along with Reynold Keene's 13-year-old orphan niece, Margaret Stout, called Peggy, all these children were left in the care of Sarah Sally Barry and 2 enslaved women. The Keenes are known to have been a slaveholding family. Reynold was a 4th-generation Swede in the American colonies, and he was born in Barbados, where the family had sugar plantations and most certainly had enslaved people. Philadelphia was a leading center for sugar refinery, and the Keenes owned property in the Northern Liberties section, where a lot of refineries were built. So in his letter to his friend Lukens, Keene actually asked Lukens to look after his and Peggy's estates and affairs in Philadelphia, and that included the purchase of warm winter socks and shirts for 3 of Keene's enslaved people, and he also asked Lukens to look in on an elderly retired slave that he supported. So somehow, I'm not sure how, I'm pretty certain from the research that I did that Lukens was a Quaker, and somehow he managed to avoid being exiled and stay in Philadelphia, even though he was a Quaker, and that may have been due to his association with the Penn family. Lukens had served as a surveyor general for the proprietors of Pennsylvania, which was the Penn family, until the closing of the land office in 1776. But Lukens may even have had loyalist leanings, because Keene refers to the line drawn between them. And I'm not exactly sure what he means, but that's a copy of Keene's letter to Lukens. So by January 1778, Keene's estates and business interests demanded that he visit Philadelphia himself. And he left Sally in charge of the children. Now, Keene was not the first of the Philadelphia refugees living at Reading to venture back home to Philadelphia for one reason or another. And we know that because Jacob Hiltzheimer's diary tells us so. Hiltzheimer wrote that Joseph Gray made the trip earlier that month, slipping back into the city, for what reason? I love this, to purchase new clothing. Okay, so Reading homespun just wasn't good enough for this man. He had to go to Philadelphia to get new clothes. And Hiltzheimer says he returned to Reading unmolested. So Gray's visit to Philadelphia went unnoticed, but Keene's did not. Keene's correspondence with the Philadelphia associates and his elitist manner in Reading had already cast suspicions that he harbored loyalist sympathies. And that business trip to Philadelphia and then his delay there attending to business just really seemed to clinch it in the eyes of his fellow commission member, Colonel Haller, commander of the local militia. So Haller took it upon himself to write to President Thomas Wharton of the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, accusing Keene of having gone over to the enemy, the British. Wharton, who was also a Philadelphia merchant, and his executive council agreed to take precautionary measures. And so in March of 1778, the General Assembly ordered Keene to stay in Philadelphia and to stand trial for treason before April 20th. In the meantime, his goods and his property were confiscated by the Commonwealth and held for public auction. And now just a word here about J. Bennett Nolan. J. Bennett Nolan's walks in Reading Town has a lot of errors. And George Miser always says that it's because he was serving during World War II in a clerical position and wrote that book without his notes, wrote it just from memory. But Nolan tells us that Keene was imprisoned in the old Reading jail at 5th and Washington. That never happened because Keene was ordered to remain in Philadelphia and did. All the documents in the state archives show that Keene stayed in Philadelphia. He did not come back to Reading. So, but all of his goods and property were confiscated and held for a public auction. Now, when the family's goods were seized, Sally Barry was very upset. And she wrote to the Executive Council, and this letter survives in the state archives. And she used her position as the wife of Captain Barry, obviously a patriot, and she petitioned on behalf of the Keene children. The Keenes were renting a house in Reading until March 1st, 1778, she wrote. And she said, since the British continued to occupy Philadelphia, she and the children intended to stay longer, and they needed their household items. So she asked to keep their bedding and their kitchen utensils and their furniture. And she also requested that some of the furniture be sent to Philadelphia for Reynold Keene to use. Well, President Wharton responded and said that if Mrs. Barry chose to take care of the children, council had no objection. However, if she wanted any of the goods, she would have to bid on them at the auction, and she was forbidden from sending anything to Reynold in Philadelphia. So Keene's niece, Peggy Stout, also protested and wrote her own letter to the council. She said that her Negro girl was her property. Her father had willed her the girl, and she wanted to keep her property. And it was unfair to the Commonwealth to confiscate her inheritance. And she asked to take her slave girl and return to Philadelphia, but her request was also denied. So, and this story, I think, just really brings home the horrors of slavery. Imagine being willed, a person being willed like a horse. When Keene's goods and items were auctioned on Penn Square on February 21st, 1777, and this auction letter survives in the state archives. The auction record, the items sold, the amounts brought for each item. It's a remarkable document. So among those items, enumerated on there and evaluated on there were two women, one a teenage girl and one an elderly woman, and they were sold. The young girl brought 130 pounds and the old lady brought 35 pounds. So the fate of these two women just really, I think, helps to illuminate the horrors of slavery in America. Because just imagine being an elderly woman or a young teen torn away from basically the only family you really know. And it's in wartime. You're in a strange town. Now you're going to have to serve strangers in a strange town. And chances are they're not even going to speak your language because you speak English and they speak German or Pennsylvania Dutch. Some kind of a Germanic dialogue. So the fear and uncertainty must have been almost unbearable for these women. And also, just imagine, and I get emotional talking about this, imagine being evaluated as a thing, as a possession, and not as you're less than a human being. It's very sad to me to compare the value of two people with the prices that were realized for other household items sold at the auction. Keene's chariot, for example, brought 277 pounds, way more than either person. His feather bed and bolster sold for 45 pounds, more than the older woman. Also sold at the auction were 4 family portraits that Sally Barry bought for £1 and 5 shillings, and a Delft porcelain plate, which sold for only 15 shillings. So among the other items sold were a gentleman's powder wig and blue velvet coat, perhaps the very items that we saw Keene wearing in his portrait, as he was wearing what appears to be a blue velvet coat and a wig. So now I'm going to go back to Alexander Graydon again, because Graydon's memoirs give us insight, obviously, into the tensions among the townsfolk in Reading during the Revolutionary War. So after his release as a British POW, Graydon joined his mother, as I said, and the other refugees in town. And he was really surprised, he wrote, to find that the price of wine and other alcohol in the area had escalated. Conversely, he remarked, militia captains, majors, and colonels had become dog cheap. Now, Graydon has this snarky sense of humor, and that cracks me up. But more often than not, Graydon said, such officers were not leading their men in the field of battle, but instead were engaged as barkeepers, condescendingly serving out small measures of liquor to their less dignified customers. They were, in Graydon's words, brimful of patriotism, the prevailing feature of which was an ardent pursuit of and fervent hatred of Tories. So one of the other things that J. Bennett Nolan has told us, and I'm not really sure, I haven't fact-checked him on this one, but he says that the Reverend Alexander Murray, who was pastor of Christ Episcopal Church, was persecuted and accused of being a Tory. So going back to Graydon, he noticed that as Whiggism, and remember that was the really zealous patriot political party, as Whiggism declined among the upper classes, it increased among the lower. Now, this is Graydon being really snooty, which he is. He attributed this to the power and consequence obtained by the working and laboring classes. And what he wrote was, uniforms and epaulets with militia titles and paper money made numbers of persons gentlemen who had never been so before. So all of a sudden now they have these military titles and they're wearing uniforms and they're flashing around their continental dollars, and now they're gentlemen. But, in Graydon's eyes, they are not really gentlemen. He says, could there, in fact, be any comparison between the condition of a daily drudge in agricultural or mechanical labor and of a spruced up militiaman living without work and at the same time having plenty of continental dollars in his pocket? So it's really not hard to imagine the scene at Reading with these newly promoted militia officers swaggering around town, full of self-importance and patriotic zeal, while the elite Philadelphia socialites condescendingly received their calls or declined to admit them at all. They're not home. And didn't socialize with them, didn't invite them to their exclusive parties. So the Association of the Refugees, oh, I mentioned this before, the Association of the Refugees with the British officers who were held as prisoners of war, and also the refugees' refusal to join the local militias, which they looked down on as being filled with Pennsylvania Germans, did not help the refugees' reputations in Reading. And Graydon wrote that all of the Philadelphia families staying in Reading were branded as Tories. Now, these were people who, in general, couldn't stay in Philadelphia because they were considered patriots. And so they had to flee, but now here in Reading, they're branded as Tories. So even Graydon himself could not escape that label, even though he had served in the field for the cause of independence and had been captured and been detained as a prisoner of war. He was called a Tory. He said, "I should have stayed home." As local pride was wounded, something akin to a Tory witch hunt, with accusations of loyalist sympathies or downright treason, brewed in downtown Reading. It was in such an atmosphere that Keene was accused by Haller of going over to the enemy and was attainted a traitor. And this meant that Keene was deprived of his of his liberty, basically. I lost my cursor for some reason. Well, we'll just do that. Keene did not receive his order to stand trial until the middle of April. And by that time, it was too late to comply with the order. So he then petitioned to the Pennsylvania Assembly to release him from the order. He protested his innocence, and he offered witnesses who would testify that his conduct was innocent and inoffensive. So his estates were never restored to him, but eventually it all just kind of went away. The whole thing went away. So while the refugees were at Reading, there was a change in command of the British Army, and General William Howe resigned and was replaced by Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton. And Clinton shipped many loyalists and most of his heavy equipment by sea to New York, and then evacuated Philadelphia on June 18th, 1778. And then when the occupation ended, most of the revolutionary refugees staying in Reading went back home to Philly. I really wish I could see my notes here. I don't know how to get this cursor back again. So General Mifflin was investigated due to accusations that he profited personally from the purchase and sale of equipment and supplies while he was serving as quartermaster general in 1776 and later in 1778. And he was granted leave to go home. And then he resigned his commission in February 1779. But he remained active in politics after the war, as we know. Colonel Haller was appointed wagon master general in 1779 and 1780, a military position that made him responsible for the transportation duties of goods and baggage. In 1785, he and his wife, also named Christiana, sold their home and lots in Reading and moved with their family to Brunswick Township, which was then in Berks, but is now part of two townships in Schuylkill County. And one thing I did want to mention when I said the name Christiana, it reminded me something I forgot to mention about Ranald and Christiana Keene. Although they had Swedish ancestry, they had assimilated. So Franklin, he didn't like the Swedish people too much either, but by the time of the Revolutionary War, most of the Swedish people were just kind of lumped in with the Anglicans. Many of the Swedish Lutheran churches shared church space, like at St. Gabriel's in Douglasville, which then became an Episcopal church, which was the American offshoot of the Anglican Church. So they were very much anglicized. The Swedes were very much anglicized, and during that revolutionary refugee period, they were lumped in by the local Pennsylvania German population. They were lumped in with the English or the Anglican people. So I did forget to mention that. Sorry, going off on a tangent here. So back to what happened to everybody after the war. After the war, Commodore Barry resumed his career in merchant shipping, and he and Sally returned to Philadelphia. Now, her family had been torn apart by the war. Her brother, it was truly, you hear this a lot, but the American Revolution was a civil war. Sally's brother Samuel remained neutral. Her brother Isaac fought for independence with the Continental Army. Her brother William was an officer in the British Navy. So, and what's interesting is because the brother was a loyalist, when all their inheritance was confiscated by the Pennsylvania government. And for years, Sally Barry fought to try to recoup her inheritance, and she never got it. So Reynold Keene, one thing I should mention about Sally too, I can't advance my notes to see the rest, so I keep forgetting to say everything. Sally and John Barry had no children of their own, but they adopted his two orphaned nephews, his sister's children, and they reared them as their own children. And Sally remained very involved in the lives of her sister Christiana's children with Reynold Keene. And some letters still survive. They're in the Seaport Museum archives in Philadelphia, in the, I'm trying to think which, I guess it's must be like the Barry collection. I can't remember the name of the collection, but there are some letters that survive between her and some of Keene's children. After Christiana died, Reynold Keene remarried twice. First to Patience Barlow. They had no children together, but then he married Anne Lawrence, and Anne bore him another 9 children, making him the father of 19. Their eldest son, Lawrence Keene, married Gaynor Lukens, who was the daughter of Reynolds' old friend, John Lukens, the surveyor. And after the war, they returned to surveying, and Keene's son went into the surveying business along with Lukens and his sons. The accusations of 1778 do not appear to have permanently damaged Keene's reputation or subsequent political career. In 1789, he was elected an alderman of Philadelphia County, and in 1794, he was commissioned as an associate judge of the County Court of Common Pleas, offices that he held until his death in 1800. Keene and Hilsheimer remained friends, and they frequently dined together in the taverns of Philadelphia. Hilsheimer often recorded it in his diary, and he would ride out to meet Keene carried in a sedan chair. He was also on hand at the funeral of Keene's second wife, Patience, although in that event, Hilsheimer did not note anything about serving as pallbearer, so he just noted that he was at the funeral. Now, neither Hilsheimer nor Graydon made further mention in their diary or memoir after they never mentioned Reading again in writing after the return to Philadelphia in 1778. And as far as we know, neither Sally Barry nor Reynold Keene ever visited or lived in Reading following their experiences there as refugees. But now, as Paul Harvey used to say, here's the rest of the story. Now for the rest of the story. So one of Reynold and Christiana Keene's daughters did return to the town laid out by Thomas and Richard Penn in 1748. That's Reading. Her name was Mary, and Mary was only 9 years old when she fled the invading army, settled here in a strange town, lost her mother, was separated from her father. Although she did return to Philadelphia and grew up there, she came back to Reading in 1794 as the wife of a young attorney who was seeking to expand his business into the Reading area because the bar was overcrowded in Philadelphia. And that young man's name was Charles Evans. And Charles Evans went on to become a wealthy attorney, landowner, holder of much real estate, and founder of the cemetery that bears his name. And so that's the rest of the story. And Brad asked me, well, how did you get interested in this topic? That's how I got interested. I'm on the board of trustees at Charles Evans Cemetery now for like 25 years. And I just had a passionate interest in Charles and Mary and just started researching them. And thank goodness for the internet, because I found archival documents. I found that copy, the letter that Keene wrote and sent to Lukens was on an auction site, probably not even there anymore. It just happened to be up for auction while I was doing my research, and I found it. All kinds of things that I found in documents, and I didn't even have to leave my chair and computer. Even the archival things from the state archives are all available digitally, and I was able to access them. It's just remarkable. So I do have to credit Floyd Turner for some of those photos of the model that I used. And as you can tell, you know, a great many people contributed to this. And not just our diarist, Hildheimer, or our memorist Graydon. I mean, you know, people living today, historians living today, and people from this area. So I always say, you know, I learn more from people when I give these presentations than what I can teach. And so if any of you have things you want to comment or add, please feel free to do it.